Okay, I was wrong. The last story, The Banshee Witch, is not 96 pages. The reason the book is that long is because after the story's over, it gives you The Last Apprentice, The Rise of the Hunters, Book 7. So this is Book 7 of the Last Apprentice series. So, and then chapter 1, and there's 2 chapters to this, so, yeah, I was wrong. It's not 96 pages. So the story is actually like 69 or 70 pages. So, yeah, it's not 96. It still is the longest story, but it's not going to take me 3 hours. So, anyway, hello, I am the Jacob, and in this video, I'm going to be reading the 4th and final story of The Last Apprentice, A Coven of Witches. It's an unprofessional reading. I'm going to give my commentaries and reactions to it as I read, and without further ado, let's get into the final story. Alright, this story is not as long as I expected. Instead of being 96 pages, it's 69 pages. Anyway, excuse me. The Banshee Witch. So each story in this book was about a witch. The first one was, I forget what type of witch it was, but it was this witch with the scales that the dude fell in love with. The dead witch with the 3 memories. And then it was the witch in training that had to kill the brain guzzler familiar old Spig. So this is the 4th witch, the Banshee Witch. And if you don't know, banshees are a type of ghost that gives a high-pitched shriek to as a sort of premonition or warning that someone's going to die. So anyway, this is the Banshee Witch. So chapter 1, a hard lesson. The enemy before me was big, strong, and ruthless. This was dangerous, and I couldn't afford to make a mistake. He clasped a long knife in his right hand and a heavy club in his left. He was eager to use them. With a roar of anger, he charged straight at me, swinging his club in an arc from right to left. I managed to block it, but the force of the impact jarred my arm and shoulder so badly that I almost dropped my staff. I groaned and twisted away, retreating clockwise. We were in a ruined building, an old tavern long abandoned to the elements. I had been chased through the woods and thinking I'd shaken my pursuer off my trail and taken refuge here. It was a big mistake. Now I was in serious trouble. We were fighting in a confined space, down in a large, gloomy cellar with only one door. Steps led upward, but he was standing between me and my escape route. I fainted? F-E-I-N-T-E-D. So it's pronounced faint. And the definition on Google is make a deceptive or distracting movement, especially during a fight. So this book is giving me plenty of new words. I feinted with my staff, and when he responded to block it, I changed the direction of my swing and made contact with his right temple. It was a good strong blow, and he dropped to one knee. I hit him again, a hard crack on his shoulder, then I ran for it, up the steps and toward the open door. There was a thud as the knife buried itself in the woodwork to my left, just a few inches from my shoulder. Then he was pounding up the steps after me, getting nearer with every stride. I almost made it through the door, but then he jumped on me from behind, bringing me down hard, flat on my face. His right arm came across my windpipe and started to press. I'd just time to suck in a quick breath before I began to choke. I struggled, kicking my legs and twisting my body, but it was no good. I was still gripping my staff with my left hand, but from that prone position I was still gripping my staff with my leg. Oh my God, I can't read. I was still gripping my staff with my left hand, but from that prone position, couldn't use it. My eyes were darkening. He was strangling the life out of me. So I rapped 3 times on the top of the step with my right hand. Instantly, my assailant relinquished the choker hold and stood up. I stumbled to my feet, my head spinning, but feeling happy just to be able to breathe again. "Not one of your best days, Master Ward," he said, shaking his head. "Never take refuge in any room it's only got one door. Mind you, you did get in a couple of good blows with your staff, but never turn your back on an enemy with a knife. I could have stuck it in the back of your neck with my eyes shut." I bowed my head and said nothing, but I knew there was no choice. He would have put the knife into me. But I knew there was no chance. He would have put the knife into me from behind. His job was to train me, not kill me. I'd taken my chance of escape and had come close. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just confused because the person speaking is the one teaching this dude, but the dude that's learning is called Master Ward. So why is the dude called Master learning? I don't know. Maybe he's qualified enough to be a master, but he's still learning. I don't know. Anyway, I bowed my head and said nothing, but I knew there was no chance. He would have put the knife into me from behind. His job was to train me, not kill me. I'd taken my chance of escape and had come close to succeeding. Okay, I'm back. I just had some dinner. I'm a spook's apprentice, being trained to deal with all manner of things that come out of the dark, such as ghosts, ghasts, boggarts, and witches. Facing me was a large shaven-headed man. Oh my God, I was like, 7 heads? But I freaking read that wrong. My left eye is itching. My glasses are smudged up. And I'm tired. Facing me was a large shaven-headed man called Bill Arkwright. My master, John Gregory. Hold up. Yup, that's the dude that fell in love with the witch. I love how this dude connects all his stories together. It's very neat. My master, John Gregory, had seconded me to him for training in the physical skills needed by a spook. fighting with staves, unarmed combat, hunting, and tracking. Picking up my staff, I followed him out of the house. Soon we were on the canal bank, heading back to the dilapidated old mill that was his house. Arkwright was the spook who loaded after. Oh my God! Looked. Can I not read or something? What's wrong with me right now? Arkwright was the spook who looked after the county north of Castor. He specialized in things that came out of the lakes, marshes, and canals of this region. Water witches mainly, but there were also all manner of weird beasts, such as worms with an E. Hold up. Okay, so it's worm with an E at the end. WORME. I tried to look up that in Google, but I couldn't find anything. I don't know if that's another thing or if it's literally just a worm. But anyway, such as worms, selkies, skelts, and kelpies to contend with. Some of which I'd never seen except in the bestiary, the big book of creatures of the dark that my master John Gregory had illustrated with his own hand. I might have to get that book, because I know that was one of the books in the Spook series. Recently, we defeated the water witch Morwenna, and now Mr. Gregory had set off back to his house at Chippenden without me. The final months of my training with Bill Arkwright were proving to be the hardest I'd ever experienced. I was covered in bruises from head to foot. The practice sessions when we fought with the staves were... Oh, that was that dude. You were fighting him. So, and he was the guy that was training you. Okay. So the practice sessions when we fought with the staves were brutal, with no quarter given. But I was sharpening my skills, slowly starting to improve. Arkwright's mill had once been haunted by the ghosts of his mom and dad, trapped there despite all his efforts to release them. That had made him bitter, driving him to drink. But recently I'd helped him to liberate them, and they had gone to the light. As a result, Arkwright had slowly changed, a lot of his pain and anger dissipating. Now he drank rarely, and his temper was much better. I preferred John Gregory as my master, but Bill Arkwright was teaching me well, and despite his rough ways, I was learning to respect him. But Arkwright was still a very hard man. John Gregory kept live witches imprisoned in pits indefinitely. Bill Arkwright confined them as a punishment for a limited time. Then he killed them, cutting out their hearts so that they couldn't return from the dead. He was a good spook, but I knew him to be ruthless. It was misty on the towpath, and before we came within sight of the large tethering post on the canal bank outside the mill, we heard the bell. 3 rings indicated that it was Spook's business, so Arkwright picked up the pace, and I followed close at his heels. A middle-aged woman was standing beneath the huge bell. She wore a dark, wide-brimmed hat pulled low over her eyes, blank stockings, and sturdy leather shoes with flat heels. I thought she looked like a servant from a big house, and I was soon proved right. "Good day to you, sir," she said, giving a little courtesy. "Would you by any chance be Mr. Arkwright?" I tried to keep a straight face. Bill was wearing his cloak with the hood up against the damp and carrying his big staff with his 12-inch blade and 6 backward-facing barbs. Quite clearly, he was the local spook. "Aye, I'm Bill Arkwright," he replied. "What brings you here on a cold, damp winter afternoon. Mistress Wicklow of Loon Hall has sent me. She'd like to see you as soon as possible. We've heard a banshee wailing 2 nights in a row, and we're all frit to death. The gardener saw it on the lakeside near the narrow bridge. It was washing a burial shroud in the water, which means someone is going to die soon. Let me be the judge of that, Arkwright said. My mistress thinks it'll be her husband. Arkwright raised one eyebrow. Is he in good health at present? Fell off his horse in the autumn and broke a leg, got pneumonia soon after it, and it's left him with a bad cough. Mistress says he's not the man he was, getting worse by the hour. Tell your mistress I'll be there before dark. The servant gave another little curtsy, and with a muttered thanks, turned north and set off down the tow path. It's a waste of time, really, Arkwright said, as we watched her disappear into the mist. There's nothing a spook can do about a banshee. They forecast deaths, but don't bring them about. Mr. Gregory doesn't even think they do that, I said. He doesn't believe anybody can see into the future. Do you agree with him, Master Ward? Witches are able to scry? Hold up. I'm sorry, what? Scry. S-C-R-Y. That is a word. Foretell the future using a crystal ball or other reflective object or surface. Okay. I didn't know that was a word that existed. Witches are able to scry, I'm sure of it. The things they prophesy can happen. I've seen it with my own eyes. So this is Master Ward saying that witches can scry, but he also says that no one can see into the future. Oh, no, but he said Mr. Gregory doesn't think that anybody can see into the future, but he thinks that witches are able to. Your master would just say it was coincidence, Arkwright said, rubbing the top of his bald head. But I'm sure that you and I are both of the same mind. There's got to be something in it. Some people and some entities, including a banshee, can see what's going to happen in the future. So I think it's very likely that Master Wicklow or somebody else in that house will be dead before the end of the week, but it won't be the banshee that actually does the killing. It sensed a coming death, that's all. So why are we going then? Why get involved? Arkwright frowned. People expect us to help. They feel better if we're around in situations like this. Think how many times a doctor repeatedly visits the bedside of a dying man when he's unable to do anything. Sometimes not even to relieve the pain, but he visits anyway because it makes the patient and his family feel better. And we can have a second reason for going. We need the money. Clients have been few and far between recently. I've killed water witches, but nobody has paid me for it. Our larder is bare, Master Ward, and although they're easy enough to catch, we don't want to eat fish every day. Up at that big house, they pay good money to local tradesmen. So I'm sorry I'm coughing so much. And there's a third reason. If the first two aren't enough for you, an apprentice should see and hear a banshee if there's one about. It's part of your training to learn the limitations of a spook. As I said, we can do nothing about them. So that was chapter 1. Yeah. I mean, there's not really anything to say about it. It's just the introduction. But I like that it's that this final story, like the two ones in between the second and third story, were linked together through the Dead Witches. And the witch clans, the deans and stuff. And then I like how this links back to the first story, being that this is a spook who is... This is a spook like the man in the first story, and he's the apprentice of the man in the first story. So I like how it hooks back up to that story, but there's nothing really to say here with this one because it was just chapter 1. Other than one thing I don't like in stories is how, you can tell the future and see exactly what's going to happen. Well, then, what's the point? Like, I hate prophecies or destinies or whatever, because because if there's the destiny and it's going to happen, and there's someone who can see into the future, what's the point of the story if you can see the end of it? But, so that's my only nitpick of why I hate, like, psychics in stories and stuff, because in my stories, the logic that I always use whenever I write a short story or whatever is the future does not exist. This is how I would imagine time to be in real life. The future does not exist because the present hasn't gotten there yet. Matter is moving forward through time, so it hasn't gotten to the future yet. Which would also mean that the past also doesn't exist, because the present is moving further away from the past, so that would also mean that the past doesn't exist. But I don't know, but that's my time logic that I use. But, that was just a rant about that, because that's one of the things that I don't like in stories, when someone tells the future, and then it's just like, well, if you know what's going to happen in the story, what's the point of the story? But what one thing I like about that is, you being able to choose your own path in future. Like, we make our own futures. Like in the first story, the dude, John Gregory said that we make our own futures. But yeah. So I like that, but then at that point, honestly, what's the point of introducing the fate element anyway? Anyway, that was my rant. I'll come back and do chapter 2. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we're doing The Last Apprentice, A Coven of Witches by Joseph Delaney. Story number 4, The Banshee Witch, Chapter 2, The Shroud Washer. Carrying our bags and staffs, we set off within the hour, heading north. Normally, we would have taken Claw, the big wolfhound that Arkwright used to hunt water witches through the marshes. But she was expecting pups and would give birth any day now. Let's hope they give us a bite of supper and a hot drink, Arkwright growled as we left the canal, and headed northeast to the trees. It's a miserable, damp night to keep watch. We hadn't been walking much more than a half an hour when we saw a figure jump over a stile and head our way. down the towpath. It was a red-faced farmer striding toward us in big muddy boots. He looked very worried, as if carrying the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. "Here comes trouble," Arkwright said, keeping his voice low as the man approached. Not known for paying his bills, his farmer... What the frick? Not known for paying his bills as Farmer Dalton. Half the tradesmen in the district are chasing him. "Thank goodness I've caught you, Mr. Arkwright," he said, blocking our path. 3 sheep have taken in one night. 3 sheep have been taken in one night. In the west pasture. The one next to the marsh. "Taken? Do you mean missing, eaten, or drained?" Arkwright asked. "Drained of blood. Big wounds or small? Deep puncture marks on their necks and backs. 3 in one night, you say? Well, it's not a ripper boggart, or their bellies would be cut open. Most likely a water witch is to blame. Though for them to take animals is rare. It suggests the witch is injured. It suggests the witch is injured and can't get human prey. In that case, she could be very dangerous. Might even approach the farmhouse." "I've young children." "Well, they'll be safe enough as long as you keep all your doors and windows secure. I'll sort it, but I expect to be paid." "Won't have money until after the spring market. I can't wait that long," Arkwright said firmly. "I'll take mutton and cheese in direct payment." "A week's supply. Is that a deal?" The farmer nodded, but clearly wasn't pleased at having to cough up payment so soon. "I'll be there soon after dark," said Arkwright. "I've another job to attend to first." The farmer soon left us, climbing back over the stile to head for his farm. Now clearly really worried that his family might be at risk. The mist thickened, hampering our progress, and we didn't reach the manor house much before dark. Loon Hall was big and with a fancy turret, and was set in extensive grounds approaching it from the west. I could see a lake to the rear, with a small island at its center, connected to the main garden by a narrow ornamental bridge. Beyond the lake was what looked like an ancient mound. "Is that a burial mound?" I asked. "A barrow?" "Indeed it is, Master Ward. Some say it's the last resting place of an important Celtic chieftain." The Celts were the race who arrived in the country as the native little people were starting to decline. Centuries later, they sailed west across the sea to land to the large island called Ireland and made that their home. I turned my attention back to the large and imposing house. Only lords, ladies, knights, and squires would be admitted through the front door of such an establishment. So Arkwright led us round the back to the tradesman's entrance. After he knocked twice, the door was opened by the same maid who'd made the journey to the mill. She showed us into the kitchen and without being asked, she brought us each a bowl of hot soup and some generous slices of bread, thickly buttered. We sat at the table and tucked in. When we'd finished, she led us along a gloomy wood-paneled corridor and out into a small flagged yard to the rear, where a small woman in a dark, well-tailored coat and sturdy walking shoes was waiting. "This is Mr. Arkwright, ma'am," said the maid, who immediately turned and went back into the house, leaving us alone with her mistress. "Good evening, Mr. Arkwright," said the woman, giving us a warm smile. "Is this your apprentice?" Her accent told me that she originated from Ireland. And I am not doing a freaking Irish accent. Every time I do an Irish accent, it sounds like a crappy Scottish accent. So, I ain't doing a freaking Irish accent. Probably most of these people are freaking British, so I ain't doing a British accent for any of the characters. Anyway, where are we at? Oh. Her accent told me that she originated from Ireland. Long ago, when I visited the Topley market with my dad, there were lots of horse traders there from that country. They used to raise their mounts up and down the muddy lanes. "Is it that, ma'am?" Bill Arkwright replied. I almost said LaPride. Sometimes when I read words that switch between R's and L's, like replied, like it has an R and L in it, I switch the L's and R's around because they're similar and sound like and ol. I mean, is just your tongue going up to the roof of your mouth, like the front of your tongue, and then an L, well, it's like a hard American L, like which is like your tongue, the front of your tongue touching where you would make a T, and then the back of your tongue is going up near the roof of your mouth, so instead of the front, but your tongue is still sort of up, so I get them confused. Anyway, Bill Arkwright LaPride giving a little bow. His name, Bow. I hate how bow and bow is the same freaking spelling, but it's bow and bow. I think bow should be spelled with an A. His name is Tom Ward. "Well, thank you both for coming so promptly," she said. "I do fear that my husband's life is in danger. His cough is worsening by the hour." As the doctor, that voice cracked though, as the doctor attended him, asked Arkwright. "To be sure, he comes twice a day, but can find no explanation for my husband's very sudden deterioration. He had recovered fully from the pneumonia. There's no reason for him to get worse now. I fear the Banshee has marked him for death. I'm just hoping that you can do something to save him. Follow me. I'll show you where she appears." It was still winter, so the garden was not at its best. Even so, you could tell that in spring and summer it would really be something special. It was subdivided into many sections, the path weaving its way through wicker archways. Wicker? What's a wicker? The path weaving its way through wicker archways and bowers sheltered, how did I read that as stretched? By stone ivy-clad walls. The shrubs and ornamental trees gradually started to give way to larger species of oak and ash as the garden merged naturally into a wood. We followed Mistress Wicklow down the long garden path toward the bridge that crossed the lake to give access to the island. In my country, Banshee means woman of the Fey folk, she said, glancing back at us over her shoulder. A Fey is what you'd call a fairy in the country. In the county. Keep reading county as country. We don't believe in goblins or in fairies, ma'am, Arkwright told her. We have enough to contend with without them. I'm sure you do, Mr. Arkwright, but this threat is real enough. Matthew, my gardener, has seen her, and I've heard her. 'Tis a terrible scream, enough to curdle the blood. Anyway, here is Matthew. He is waiting for us now. Matthew stepped forward out of the gloom and touched his cap in respect. He was old and weather-beaten, long past his prime. It must have been hard for him to keep up the hard physical work for his gardener to such a big house. Tell them what you saw, Matthew, Mistress Wicklow commanded. The gardener nodded and shivered. It was yonder, he said, pointing toward the lake. It was standing on the narrow bridge, thinking how the lilies wanted thinning out. What? I was standing on the narrow bridge, thinking how the lilies wanted thinning out when I saw her kneeling on the bank. Oh my God. I laid onto the keyboard. Probably typed a whole freaking URL into my document I'm writing. I need to turn the TV on to see first. Can you turn on or not? Oh no, I had iTunes open. Okay. I was standing on the narrow bridge, thinking how the lilies wanted thinning out, when I saw her kneeling on the bank. On this shore or on the island, Arkwright interrupted. This shore, sir. She was kneeling right on the edge of the lake, washing something in the water. It looked like a burial shroud to me. The moon was shining brightly, and I could see that the material was covered in dark stains. I was scared, fixed to the spot. I couldn't tear my gaze away. She kept dipping the shroud into the water, then wringing it out. But the stains were still there, the water darkening each time, but she couldn't wash it clean. Then she turned her head and looked straight at me, gave a terrible wailing cry that almost killed me stone dead on the spot. A second later she disappeared, but I'll never forget her. What she looked like? Was she young or old? My master asked. That was the surprising thing, sir. She was young and really pretty. It was hard to believe that such a terrible cry could be uttered by such a comely mouth. Well, ma'am, we'll stay here tonight and keep watch, Arkwright told Mistress Wicklow. I suggest that nobody approaches this part of the garden for at least 24 hours, but then we should know what's what. By then, we should know what's what. Then I'll leave everything in your hands, she said. I have faith in you, Mr. Arkwright. You look strong and dependable. If anyone can save my husband's life, it'll be you. Arkwright bowed, and with a little smile for both of us, Mistress Wicklow turned and walked back toward the house. I looked at my temporary master. I wondered if he had forgotten all about the farmer he'd promised to help with the water witch that evening. I was about to ask him about it when he looked at me and shook his head. I fear there is nothing to be done here, he said sadly. If Mistress Wicklow's husband is going to die, he'll die, and there's nothing you or I can do about it. But there's no point in me telling her that. I wasn't happy with Arkwright's attitude. John Gregory would have told her the truth, but it wasn't worth saying anything to him. My new master was a law unto himself, and he soon answered my question about the farmer. Well, Master Ward, I'll be off to deal with the water witch, but should be back sometime tomorrow. Probably best if they think I'm keeping watch too. It means that when you go to the kitchen at dawn, they'll give you 2 breakfasts to bring back here. Aren't you a lucky lad? Looks like being a long, cold night first, I grumbled. I didn't like the idea of misleading Mistress Wiglow. But he simply shrugged and told me, you've got the easy job. Forget all the fairies and fays nonsense. A banshee is just an elemental, and a low-level one at that. Was this D&D? And this one's pretty with it. Pretty with it? What more could you want? She can't hurt you, so get as close to as you can and see what she's about. With that, Arkwright gave me a wink, headed for the edge of the garden, and pushed through the hedge to rejoin the lane. Soon the mist began to lift, and the large disk of the moon rose over the trees. It was waning 2 days beyond full, but it cast a strong silver light over the garden. I decided to keep watch from the bridge. At first I stood leaning against the wooden rail, but finally I grew weary and settled myself down cross-legged on the boards, my staff in my left hand, my bag close by me. I kept nodding off and waking up suddenly, so finally I lay down on my back and rested my head on my bag. Then I closed my eyes. Had Bill Arkwright been here, we have taken it in turns to keep watch while the other slept. But what did it matter in this case? The banshee couldn't actually hurt anyone, and if it appeared on the lake shore, its cry would wake me up instantly. So I allowed myself to fall asleep. But suddenly I awoke. Something was wrong. A cold feeling was running the length of my spine, the one that warned me when something from the dark was close. I seized my staff and got quickly to my feet. Instantly I heard a terrible wail, which made me shiver and shake. No animal or bird of the night could utter such a terrifying sound. I knew it had to be the banshee. That unnerving cry seemed to have come from the far side of the lake. I decided to go and take a closer look, as my master had instructed. So I left the bridge and began to follow the shore counterclockwise, heading for the source of that chilling scream. There were lots of shrubs and trees close to the lake, mainly willows with long trailing branches. The ground was boggy underfoot, so my progress was slow. Again I heard the wail of the banshee, this time much closer. It stopped me dead in my tracks. Arkwright had said that the banshee wasn't dangerous, but that cry suggested otherwise, and the hairs on the back of my neck were beginning to rise. that rhymed. And then I saw her. She had her back to me and was kneeling in the mud right on the very edge of the water. Arkwright had advised me to get a really close look. Why not? She couldn't harm me, he said. So I took a cautious step nearer, then another one. Yes, she was washing something in the lake, and the gardener had been right. It certainly looked like the shroud they wrapped a corpse in before nailing it inside of the coffin. I moved closer still. The figure had her back turned to me, and I could see the stains spreading in the water like black ink. Blood from the shroud? It certainly looked like it. And what was it that I'd read in the Spook's Bestiary? Blood on the Banshee Shroud meant that a violent death was being foretold. But Mr. Wicklow was ill with worsening congestion of the lungs, perhaps resulting from pneumonia, so that didn't fit. Unless someone else in the house was going to die violently. I took another couple of steps. Then I became aware of something else. Perched on a branch directly above the Banshee, I saw a large... Perched on the branch directly above the Banshee, I saw a large black crow. It seemed to be staring directly at me. I shivered. There was something baleful and malevolent about that bird. Suddenly the Banshee pulled the shroud out of the water and started to wring it dry. At the same time she wailed for a third time. A cry so terrible and intense that I held my breath until it was finished and felt myself trembling all over. The cry stopped as quickly as it begun, and she carried on, twisting the shroud as if determined to wring every last drop of moisture from it. While she was thus occupied, I took another step toward her. That was a mistake. A twig cracked under my foot, and the Banshee turned her head and looked directly at me. My mouth grew dry, and my whole body started to tremble. The cold feeling down my spine was much more intense. The gardener had been right about the burial shroud, but wrong about the Banshee's face. It was hideous, pitted and crackled like the surface of a dry lake bed in a high summer. The eyes were just two dark holes. She opened her mouth wide, but instead of that blood-curdling wail, the Banshee hissed at me like an angry cat. No doubt she meant to terrify me, but I stood my ground, gazing directly into that horrible face. I expected the water elemental to disappear, but to my surprise, she got to her feet, and then she spoke. "Be gone, boy. Don't linger here, or you'll be dead." No sooner had she uttered those words than the black crow flapped its wings and took flight. I didn't think banshees spoke. They were known only for their terrible wail. Now she began to move away from me along the lake shore, walking quickly. I followed, but as I passed the place where she'd been washing the shroud, a shaft of moonlight showed me footprints in the mud. She was barefoot. Not only that, I could hear the sound of squelching feet moving away from me. This wasn't a banshee, I was sure of it, because they weren't solid. But what exactly was I dealing with? Some sort of witch? Had that black crow been of her familiar? Molehill witches went barefoot. Surely there wasn't one here. She started to run, and I gave chase. Now I regretted leaving my silver chain in my bag. I could have cast it ahead of me and brought her down. I hadn't thought I'd be dealing with something solid that ran so quickly. She was beginning to widen the gap between us, and there directly ahead, right at the edge of the trees, was the burial mound. She made straight for it and was now out in the open. While I was still hampering by trees, there was a sudden flash of bright light directly ahead. It blinded me momentarily, and I almost ran into a low branch, grazing it with my head. Then I burst out of the trees. I was in the open too now, but there was no sign of the Banshee. I stopped and looked about me. Nothing. Then I approached the grassy mound cautiously. It was roughly oval in shape, and on the side nearest to me rose up quite steeply in an almost vertical wall. I looked down and saw the footprints in the mud. They led right up to the earthen wall. It was as if the witch had suddenly disappeared. Either that or somehow run right into the mud. Puzzled, I did one full circuit of the mound and then ahead back through the trees toward the ornamental bridge. Once there, I settled down for the night again, wrapped in my cloak with my head resting on my bag. It was very cold and my sleep was fitful. I kept thinking over what happened, what was going on. This certainly wasn't a banshee we were facing, not according to what I'd read. I had a lot to tell Bill Arkwright. By dawn, I was pacing back and forth across the bridge, deciding whether or not it was too early to go to the kitchen and ask for my breakfast. Perhaps I would get two, as Arkwright had suggested. Why not? I was certainly hungry enough. Thinking I'd waited long enough, I was just about to set off for the house when I heard footsteps in the lane, and Bill Arkwright forced his way through the hedge and back into the garden. I started. I hadn't expected him back so soon. As soon as I saw his face, I groaned inwardly. He was leaning heavily on his staff and walking with a pronounced roll of his shoulders. He looked very angry. What was worse, his lips were stained purple. He'd been drinking red wine. He did so only rarely these days, but it never helped his mood. "Shall I go and get us some breakfast?" I suggested as he approached the bridge. "Breakfast? You can forget about that, Master Ward. It's the last thing I want. I should have gone straight to the farm instead of bringing you here to see this blessed banshee." "It's not," I began, about to tell him what I'd discovered. But his face instantly darkened with anger. "Shut your mouth. Just listen for once," he roared. "It was a worm, not a water witch, and a blooming one at that. It got into the farmhouse and killed a child, blood and bone," he cursed. "A child died because I came here." I bowed my head, not knowing what to say. We're going back right away. It's holed up somewhere in an old boathouse, and it'll take two of us to flush it out. A very dangerous thing is a worm. So come on, let's waste no time or it'll kill again. With those words, he led us back onto the lane, and soon we were hurrying back toward the canal and the farm beyond it, the Banshee far from our thoughts. That was chapter 2 of The Banshee Witch. And I expected the Banshee to not be a Banshee because the story is the Banshee Witch, and there was the whole thing about, oh my god, it's the like Arkwright is like not the smartest dude, so he was like, oh, it's just a Banshee. Get a close look at it. It won't hurt you. It's just a Banshee, and then. And then he got close to it, and then he started getting scared, and then he was like, oh my god, it's a freaking witch. And then some weird crap happened with the mound, and I don't know what happened, but he was like, I don't know, this story's getting pretty freaking interesting. Got 3 more freaking chapters left. Okay, so the next day is technically not fall yet, but not my nose says it's autumn. So we're getting Halloween vibes in here. And let's battle the worm, whatever the frick that is. So, the Banshee Witch, Chapter 3, The Worm. A cold wind was blowing in from the sea, so I pulled up my hood to keep my ears warm. I lagged behind Arkwright for most of the way, knowing of old that he was not in the mood for company, and that the only words I'd hear would be curses. But once we'd crossed the canal and were on the track that led to the farm, he beckoned me forward to walk alongside him. Listen carefully, Master Ward, because what I say might just save your life. I'm going to tell you what I know about worms, which, as you know, are spelled with an E at the end to set them apart from an ordinary earthworms. Some have legs, most have tails, and all are vicious and very bad-tempered. I saw the tracks the creature made in the mud. This one has legs and a tail. The legs will give it speed, so watch out. The thought of facing such a danger made me feel nervous. Arkwright had been prepared to risk tackling it alone, so this was clearly going to be a very hazardous job. Their bodies are eel-like but covered with very tough green scales like armor plates, which are very difficult to penetrate with a blade. He went on. And as for their jaws, they're long, with a mouth full of razor-sharp fangs that can easily bite off a head or arm. Worms are very dangerous creatures, Master Ward. They can be the size of a small dog or as big as a horse. This one is bigger than me, surprisingly big to stray this far south, away from the lakes. That's where they are usually to be found. When they catch a human, they usually kill their victim by squeezing him to death before eating him, bones and all, leaving hardly a trace. But with animals such as cattle, they just bite deeply and suck out the blood. That's what this one did with the sheep. That's why I made the mistake of thinking it was a water witch. A mistake that cost a young boy's life. It got into the house and dragged him from his bed. When the farmer went upstairs to check on the boy before going to bed himself, it was already too late. The worm had eaten him. All that remained was blood-stained fragments of his nightshirt. Okay. What Arkwright had described was terrible and sad. I felt really sorry for the parents. No wonder my master was angry, but it was a mistake that any spook could have made. Some people call them dragons, Arkwright continued. That's because they breathe out clouds of steam to confuse their prey. It hides them while they spit. That spit is poisonous and could kill a fully grown man in just minutes. This monster is sounding very dangerous. It sounds like there's almost no way to kill it. I mean, y'all can just wait, I don't know what year these technically take place, but if y'all just wait until something called a gun exists. That should get them. Just like, just shoot them and just shoot them. Especially nowadays, how we have literal automatic shotguns with a barrel of shells attached to the gun. Just boom, 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 boom. You know, right into its face, and it'll just shred it to pieces. Anyway, just get an RPG. Anyway, if it makes contact with your skin, you're as good as dead. If it even touched your breeches or shirt, it would soak through in seconds, still probably delivering a lethal dose. Oh my god. But with two of us on the attack, it'll be confused. It won't know which of us to tackle first, and that'll give us a better chance of dealing with it. Any questions? Will I be able to use my silver chain against it? Arkwright shook his head. You'd be wasting your time, Master Ward. Despite those scales, it's sinuous and slippery, and would soon wriggle clear of it. No, it's immune to silver and to salt. We use our stabs. That's the safest and surest way. Let me deal with it directly while you approach it from one side. Keep some distance between us to confuse it. Then it won't be absolutely sure where the main threat will come from. Hopefully it will be able to get in close and finish it off. Hopefully I'll be able to get in close and finish it off before it can do me any serious damage. As we passed the farmhouse, we heard a woman wailing inside. No doubt the poor mother who'd lost her young son. We continued down the narrow, muddy track which led to a water channel and then ran alongside it. We were now passing through a marsh and approaching the sea. There was little water in the channel at that moment, but it was tidal and allowed small boats access to the sea. A number of wooden boathouses were dotted along its edges, and Arkwright stopped outside the largest. The building was as big as a barn, but dilapidated and falling into despair. I saw that the clasp on the small door was fastened with a coil of barbed wire. Well, here we are, Arkwright said. This is the place I tracked it to. Let's hope it's still lurking in here. It's likely to stay here because it's fed recently and will remain under cover until it next goes hunting again, probably after dark tonight. Let's check before we go in. Arkwright circled the boathouse warily around us. The marsh grass was bent and twisted. It danced to the dictates of the wind. The landscape was flat and bleak, with mud flats in the distance. It seemed totally deserted, but for the seabirds far above, descending in long, slow spirals out of the gray winter sky. There, can you see the tracks? That's where it went in. On the channel side of the boathouse, there was a mud slope that led from a huge door down to the water. This was where boats were launched. There were clawed tracks smeared in places where the worm's tail had slicked across the mud. The door was rotten, with most of the planks broken away near the bottom, leaving a jagged lower edge. The creature had squeezed itself underneath. We completed the circuit, and Arkwright nodded in satisfaction. No fresh tracks, Master Ward, so it's still here. Light a candle, it'll be dark in here. I pulled a candle stub from my pocket and got the tinder box from my bag. I had to crouch low near the door and shield both from the cold wind, but in moments I'd managed to light the wick. Wow, this is even before matches were a thing. Well, I think guns were made before matches, but still, this is... Wow. Ready, Arkwright asked. I nodded. It took Arkwright just seconds to twist the wire free of the clasp across the small door. Then he stepped inside cautiously, his staff at the ready. I followed close behind, protecting the flickering candle as best I could. The moment I entered, I knew that the worm was lurking nearby. The whole area was filled with a dense, warm mist that had a noxious, acrid stink, making my eyes water. It was the breath of the creature. No wonder some people confused worms with dragons, thinking that they breathed fire. The rotting hulk of a boat filled most of the space inside. It was supported by wooden beams 3 feet or more above the earthen floor, and something large scuttled out toward us from the darkness beneath. I caught a glimpse of a wide mouth full of sharp, murderous teeth. Then most of the worm came into view. It was big, all right, and it had been able to stand upon its hind legs. It would have been taller than Arkwright, and then tail trailing behind it added another third to that. But its legs were stubby and large, toes were webbed and armed with sharp curved talons, so that its body was almost scraping the earth. As Arkwright had told me, it had green scales covering its long body. Which a sudden loud hiss the worm breathed out, and a large plume of steam erupted from its nostrils, making it difficult to see. Arkwright jabbed downward at it with his staff. He missed the head by inches, and it scampered backward until the rear half of its body was once more under the hulk of the boat. It snarled up at us, its small eyes glittering in the candlelight. "Stand back, Master Ward. I'll deal with this," Arkwright said, moving forward and readying the blade of his staff. Suddenly the creature spat, and Arkwright quickly stepped to one side just in time to avoid the large globule of dark liquid that had been aimed for his legs. "Keep your distance," he advised, gesturing me back with his right arm. "Remember what I said about worm spit. If the venom touches your skin, you could be dead within minutes. Pass me the candle, then move away to the left." I handed him the candle, and he held it high. The worm seemed to move its head and stare toward the light, but then it twisted back to face Arkwright and breathed another plume of mist. Next, hidden by that cloud, it hissed and spat again. A thick ball of slime landed on Arkwright's right boot. Luckily, the boot leather would be too thick to be penetrated. It was a good job it hadn't landed on his trousers. Again, Arkwright moved the candle. "The light fascinates it," he said softly. "It's a good idea to distract its attention. Now you move a little closer and threaten it with your staff. Not too close, mind." I did as he commanded, thrusting my staff toward it. Its eyes were on me now and then in a fury. His staff raised, Arkwright suddenly rushed in to attack the ugly creature. He brought the blade down hard 3 times in quick succession. The first blow missed as the beast twisted away, but the second and third blows struck home, and the long blade went deep into its head and neck. It thrashed and writhed, sliding back into the darkness under the boat. Its blood was dark and thick, a viscous slime oozing out onto the ground. Arkwright handed the candle back to me. "Crouch down and give me as much light as possible," he ordered. Then he put down his staff. fished a long-bladed knife from his bag, and crawled under the boat. By the light of the candle, I watched him stabbing the creature again and again until it gave a great gasp and lay still. "Not quite as difficult as I'd thought," he remarked when once more he was standing beside me. "Well, Master Ward, let's go and tell Farmer Dalton the job's done." In answer to Arkwright's triple rap, the farmer came to the front door. I saw that his eyes were red and swollen with grief. "The beast's body is lying in the biggest of the boatyards yonder, and soon it'll start to rot," Arkwright said, gesturing toward the salt marsh. "It'll need attending to. I have urgent business elsewhere now." The farmer nodded and gave a great sob that shook his whole body. "I'm sorry for the loss of your son," Arkwright said respectfully. The man nodded but couldn't speak. "Well, we'd best be on our way," continued my master. "Wait, you'll want paying," said the farmer. "Forget the mutton and cheese. I do have a little emergency money in the attic." "No payment is required," my master said. "Put it toward the funeral expenses." With that, we were on our way east again, heading back toward the Wicklow's residence. For a while we walked in silence, keeping up a steady pace, but then I remembered the strange business of the Banshee. "The Banshee, Mr. Arkwright. The Banshee indeed, Master Ward. We really do need to be seen to sort that Banshee now. We must hope they pay us well for our trouble. I hadn't the heart to take anything from Dalton after what happened." "But it wasn't a Banshee, Mr. Arkwright. At least I don't think so." Arkwright came to a sudden halt and glared at me. "Did you see it?" he demanded. I nodded. "Was she as pretty as the gardener said?" I shook my head. "Well, he was an old man. To a man of his age, any woman looks pretty." "She was hideous. Her skin was cracked and disfigured." "Was she washing a burial shroud?" "It was covered in blood, and there were big dark stains in the water. That predicts a violent death, doesn't it? Yet Master Wicklow is suffering from a congestion of the lungs." Arkwright rubbed the top of his head and frowned. "So what makes you think it wasn't a banshee?" "She left footprints in the mud at the water's edge. Banshees don't have footprints, do they? That type of elemental is just a spirit. And she spoke to me, warned me off, said if I lingered, I'd be dead. Then she sent off through the trees." As I spoke, I heard her voice in my memory, and I realized something that I'd thought nothing of at the time. She had the same accent as Mistress Wicklow. Bum, bum, bum. It's a Scooby-Doo mystery, ladies and gentlemen. Honestly, I had a feeling in the back of my head that Mistress Wicklow was the Banshee, but I wasn't going to say anything because I'd be like, no, it's not a Scooby-Doo mystery, but it probably is now a Scooby-Doo mystery. So anyway, she had the same accent as Mistress Wicklow. She was from Ireland, the big island across the water. What was she now? So what happened then, Master Ward? Did you obey her? No, I followed her. I was running as fast as I could, but I didn't catch her. She sprinted toward the burial mound and disappeared. Her footprints went right up to it. It was as if she'd vanished. Really? Said Arkwright, scratching his head. Well, that's interesting. And just before that, there was a flash of bright light, I continued. I think she was a witch. There was a black crow on a branch just above her while she was washing her shroud. While she was washing the shroud. Could that have been her familiar? Arkwright looked thoughtful and perhaps a little worried. Come on, Master Ward, let's continue on our way. I'll have to think about this for a while. So we went on toward Loon Hall, my master silent and deep in thought. So that was that. So it might be a Scooby-Doo mystery. They might get to the Banshee and take off a mask and be like, Mistress Wicklow. And then Velma will say, I knew it the whole time. Yeah, sure, why didn't you say anything then? But anyway, yeah, it's getting interesting now. I like the description of a worm. Now I know what the frick a worm with the E at the end means. But the next chapter, hold on, let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 pages. Okay, that's pretty normal. The last chapter, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Okay. Chapter 5, 21 pages. Alright then. The Banshee Witch. Chapter 4, The Celtic Assassin. It was getting dark again by the time we reached the hall, but the sky was clear and the moon would soon be up. The moon does not... Really? The moon would soon be up? The moon doesn't go up. Like in freaking cartoons. It's there all the time. Okay. It was getting dark again by the time we reached the hall, but the sky was clear and the moon would soon be up. Right, Master Ward, we need to talk, Arkwright said, stepping off the track, placing his bag and staff on the ground and leaning back against a tree trunk. It's been a long day, and our bellies must be thinking our throats have been cut. I was going to suggest we get ourselves a bite to eat, but we can't risk that now. We need to follow the advice that John Gregory gave us, and fast before facing the dark, because I think we're about to step into unknown territory. Ever heard of the Celtic witches? Yeah, they weren't witches. They were demonized by the Christians during the Spanish Inquisition, where they went around scooching all of the freaking non-Christians out of their country, and they said no. And then the people who were, oh, they're a witch, burn them. So they burnt the witch. But they weren't witches, they were probably just Celtic people. But they didn't care. Anyway, I put down my own staff and bag and frowned, searching my memory. I'm not sure whether the Spooks Bestiary has an entry on them or not. If so, it's very short. Exactly, Master Ward, because... excuse me. Okay. Exactly, Master Ward, because not a lot's known about them. They mostly come from the southwestern region of Ireland. That whole island is shrouded in mystery. Some call it the Emerald Isle because it gets even more rainfall than the county, and the grass there is just as green. But it has dense mists too, and treacherous bogs. In the southwest there are also malevolent ghost mages. Goat mages. What the frick is a goat mage? I saw the cover online on a website, and it had the witches of the second story with the fire going around the fiend thing on the goat thingy with the fur. But what's a goat mage, though? We know more about them than we do about the witches. I do remember reading about them, I interrupted. Aye, but they worship the old god Pan. Yep. Ooh, like in Pan's Labyrinth? That movie was freaking awesome, dude. I watched it in the Spanish with the English voiced, with the English, subtitles. That was a good movie. Anyway, they're a force to be reckoned with, but never leave Ireland. As far as records go back, there is no mention of these Celtic witches visiting the country either. But among our fragments of knowledge is the name of the old god they worship, the Morrigan. She haunts battlefields, and some call her the goddess of slaughter. When summoned to this earth by one of the Celtic witches, she usually takes the shape of a large black crow. The big crow on the branch, Arkwright shrugged. Who knows? But there's one more thing that I've heard said about Celtic witches. There are lots of burial mounds in Erie. And I mean a lot. For every one we have in the county, they have at least another 10. It's said that those witches can get into burial mounds and take refuge there, and that's exactly what she did when you chased her. I'm almost certain of it. I think we're dealing with a Celtic witch, Master Ward, and because we don't know much about her or her powers, that makes her very dangerous. Before going into the garden, what's a garden? Okay. Before going into the garden to keep watch, Arkwright decided to pay his respects to the mistress of the house again, so we went round to the tradesman's entrance. This time, it was a long while before anyone answered the door, and Arkwright started snorting with impatience. The same maid answered, but this time she didn't meet our eyes and merely beckoned us inside. We were led not into the kitchen, but toward the front of the house, and were shown into a large drawing room. Mistress Wicklow was standing with her back to the fire, her face pale. She was dressed in black. To her right, beneath the curtained window, was a coffin positioned on a long, low table, draped with a purple cloth. 2 large candles were burning, one at its head, the other at its foot. My husband died suddenly last night, at the very moment when the Banshee wailed for the 3rd time. Where were you? She demanded, a dangerous chill to her voice. A child was killed by a worm, and I was called away urgently, Arkwright said abruptly, bending the truth a little. But I left my very capable apprentice here on watch, and from what he tells me, I don't think we're dealing with a banshee at all. Mistress Wicklow lowered her gaze to the carpet, and her hands started to flutter nervously. She clasped them together tightly in an attempt to keep them still. Ah, I see it now. You knew that already, didn't... Oh, okay. Ah, I see it now. You knew it already, didn't you? Arkwright accused her. You knew there was a witch out there. She looked up to meet his gaze, her eyes brimming with tears. We've been here in the county almost 5 years, and I thought we were safe, but they've sent a witch assassin after us. She's killed my husband, and I'll be next. They? Who? A witch clan? Demanded Arkwright. No, she said. shaking her head. Celtic witches don't form clans. They always work alone. The goat mages sent her. They want revenge for what my husband did. Do you know of those mages? Do you know of what they do? We know very little about them, ma'am. Most of what happens on that island of yours is a mystery to us. Each year the mages tethered a goat to a high platform, she explained. They worship it for a week and a day. Human beings are sacrificed until the animal is gradually possessed by one of the old gods called Pan, or Pan. Soon the goat starts to talk, stands upon its hind legs, and grows larger, dominating the proceedings and demanding more and more sacrifices. What she was telling us was already in the Spook's Bestiary. Arkwright would also have read it there, but he let her speak without interruption in the hope of learning something new from a native of Ireland. The power they gained during those days of bloodshed lasts the goat mages for almost a year, but some years things go badly wrong. If Pan doesn't possess the goat, the mages must flee the region, taking refuge in hiding places throughout Ireland. They're vulnerable then, and they're sworn enemies, a federation and of landowners. Okay, Carr. They're vulnerable then, and they're sworn enemies. A federation of landowners to the southwest hunt them down. My husband was part of that federation at the time, 8 years ago, when the mages were weak. He was its leader. The landowners managed to kill 5 of them. Following that, there was a succession of good years. There was a session of good years for the mages, when their power was in the ascendancy. Then it was their turn to hunt and kill the landowners. So in fear of our lives, we gathered what we could of our wealth and fled here. That this house belonged to my husband's brother, a bachelor. He died in a riding accident last year, and my husband inherited it. We thought we were safe here, but the goat mages and the Federation are in a perpetual state of war. Somehow our enemies found out where we were living and sent the witch after us. If you knew... Oh, wait. Yeah. If you knew, why didn't you tell us? My apprentice could have been killed. I thought if you found out what you faced, you might not take on the job. I was scared and desperate. What do we face then? You come from that land. What powers does a Celtic witch have, especially an assassin? This really was an area we knew nothing about. More material for my notebook. They are deadly with blades and spears. Sometimes they impale their enemies so that they die slowly. But their favorite method is the one used against my husband. The one that will soon be employed against me. They mimic banshees. That's why my people call them the Banshee witches. Though instead of just foretelling a death, they bring it about. When they lift the burial shroud from the water and wring it out, by dark magic they twist the heart and arteries of their victim. Last night, the witch wailed for the 3rd time. My husband's heart burst and blood spurted from his mouth to saturate the pillow. Tonight she'll begin the process again. This time I'll be the victim. Not if we can help it, but it may take us more than one night, Arkwright said. You have until her third cry on the third night. Then, if you fail, I will also die. Arkwright nodded, then turned to leave the room. I'm sorry for your loss, he said. He wasn't a nice man, Mistress Wicklow told us, an edge of bitterness in her voice. Ours was a marriage arranged by our families. I never loved him. He was a fool, and he caused me nothing but trouble. Arkwright bowed his head, at a loss for words. Have you eaten? She asked us. We fast when we face the dark, Arkwright answered. But we'd appreciate a light breakfast tomorrow morning. We'll need to keep up our strength for what's ahead. Mistress Wicklow rang for the maid, who showed us out. Showed us out through the tradesman's entrance once more. We began to walk down the garden, heading toward the lake. Well, Master Ward, Arkwright commented, keeping his voice low. This is something new, all right. We face a Celtic witch, so ready your silver chain. This story's getting freaking crazy, and I'm guessing by the last chapter having 20 pages in it, some poopy's about to go down. So I will be back to read that. The Banshee Witch, Chapter 5, The Banshee Cry. Once more we settled ourselves down on the narrow bridge. My silver chain was now in the left pocket of my breeches, and I coiled it about my wrist, ready to throw. We didn't have to wait long. Soon the terrible wailing banshee cry echoed over the garden. This time it came from farther around the lake, near the burial mound. Immediately Arkwright set off at a run. I followed close at his heels. The second cry came far more quickly than it had the previous night. Would the witch shriek for the third time before we reached her? She did, and I groaned inside. Mistress Wicklow would already have been hurt. Arkwright was now on my right, almost level with me, and running toward the source of the cry. There she is, he called out, pointing with his staff as he ran. I saw a female figure ahead, fleeing through the trees. Suddenly something dark swooped down toward me, claws outstretched. I ducked and glanced to my right as it glided on silently toward Arkwright. It was the large black crow I had seen the previous night. I heard him cry out, saw him stumble. Keep going, he shouted. Keep after her. I kept running, but the moon had gone behind a cloud, and all that told me the witch was still ahead was the slap of her bare feet against the ground. We were coming toward the end of the trees, and the mound lay just beyond the wood. This time I felt sure that I was catching up with her. I prepared to throw my silver chain, relying on my ears to guide me. All at once, straight ahead, there was an explosion of light so bright that it hurt my eyes. It was like gazing directly into the sun. My vision instantly darkened, and I stumbled to a halt. The light quickly faded in intensity. Now it was just the silver of a full moon, but one that had fallen to earth. It wasn't the moon, though. It was a circular door in the grassy wall of the burial mound. I could see the black silhouette of the Banshee Witch against it. As the light faded, I glimpsed things beyond within the mound what looked like a table and chairs. Now it was dark once again, and I walked slowly forward to face the mound. Now there was no sign of a door at all, just grass. The real moon came out again. I looked down and saw more footprints. Arkwright ran to my side. There was a cut on his head just above his left eye. Blood was running down his face. "Are you all right?" I asked. "It's nothing," he growled. "Bit of a scratch. That bird did it. Probably her familiar, so the witch got away again." I nodded. "She did go into the mound, but I'm sure of it." Where did the butt come from? I nodded. "She did go into the mound, I'm sure of it. I saw a door this time, a circular entrance, and things inside. Looked like furniture." "Furniture? You'll be telling me next that she's got a bed in there and is going to settle down for a cozy sleep. Sure you weren't seeing things, Master Ward?" "It really did look like a table and chairs." "Well, the eyes can play funny tricks in such situations, but I am inclined to believe that by use of dark magic she's somehow taken refuge in that mound." We spent the rest of the night on the bridge, taking it in turns to sleep. Not that what we expected to happen again that night. Not that we expected anything to happen again that night, but Arkwright wasn't taking any chances. At dawn, we washed our faces and hands in the lake, then went back to the tradesman's entrance once more. Your mistress promised us a bite of breakfast," Arkwright told the maid. We ate a light meal of bread, cheese, and ham, and were then shown through the drawing room again. Mistress Wicklow was sitting in an armchair in front of the fire, wrapped in a long shawl. She was shivering, and her lips had a blue tinge. I've always had a fear of dying in my bed," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "So I prefer to sit in my chair until all this ends, one way or another." She escaped into the mound," Arkwright explained. But don't you worry. She won't get away tonight." "You've hurt your face," she observed. "It was a black crow that seems to be around whenever the witch is. Probably just her familiar. Though I reckon it could be that Morrigan. But if it really is her, I'd expect her to do more than just scratch my face." Mistress Wicklow shook her head. "Not necessarily. They say that those who are cut or scratched by the Morrigan are marked for death. They always die within the year. Of course, that's probably just a foolish superstition, and it probably wasn't the goddess anyway." We thanked Mistress Wicklow for breakfast, took our leave of her, and strolled back toward the lake. It was a nice day, but there was little warmth in the sun. It would be a long wait until nightfall. I just wanted to get this over with and return to the mill. Quite a deep cut," Arkwright said, kneeling down to gaze at his face in the mirror of the lake. "Don't think it'll scar, though. Wouldn't want it to spoil my good looks." I laughed. He was on his feet in a flash and cuffed me hard across the back of the head, sending me reeling forward. I almost fell into the water. "It's not that funny, Master Ward," he said angrily. "I'm your master and you're just the apprentice. I expect a little respect." "I thought you were making a joke," I protested. "Blood and bone," he cursed. "I was, but it was a very mild joke. You laughed too long and too loud." He suddenly gave me a wolfish grin, showing a mouthful of teeth. "Get yourself ready, Master Ward. We shouldn't neglect your training. Prepare to defend yourself." With that, he picked up his staff and attacked me, trying to drive me into the lake. We fought for almost an hour, and by the end of it, muscles I didn't know I had were complaining, and I had 2 more bruises to add to my collection. But Arkwright never did manage to force me into the lake, so that counted as some sort of victory. "We'll do things differently tonight," he said as we rested on the bridge once more. "You chase her toward the mound. I'll lie in wait among the trees close to it and block her escape." It seemed a good plan, that is, if the witch didn't somehow manage to long sniff the threat. Witches could usually to see danger coming. But as seventh sons of seventh sons, spooks were usually immune to this power. Oh, so that's what a spook is. So that's why they go hunting stuff, because they're immune to that kind of power. So spook is a seventh son of a seventh son. Cool, I didn't know that. Anyway, but as 7 sons of 7 sons, spooks were usually immune to this power. Though with a witch about whom we knew little, nothing was certain. That night, the first cry of the Banshee witch told me that she was very close. This time he had farther to run in order to reach the safety of the mound. I might even be able to catch her before the edge of the wood. So putting my silver chain in my pocket and gripping my staff, I ran toward the sound. There was often an edge of competition between my temporary master and me. It would be really pleasing to bind her with my chain before he could intercept her, I thought. So I ran just as fast as I could in the direction of the cry. She would hear me coming, but I didn't care. I was on the attack. My heart was pounding, and I was filled with exhilaration. The second cry came very soon after the first. The witch would be using some kind of curse that demanded a precise form of words. Surely there had to be a limit to how fast she could utter it, but to my dismay the third cry echoed over the lake before I reached her. I groaned, remembering Mr. Swicklow's blue-tinged lips and breathlessness. Now she would have suffered further pain. I drove myself on even harder. I could hear the witch running through the trees ahead. I had to catch her. We had managed to stop her uttering the third cry tonight. What a chance had we of doing that tomorrow, when it would kill her victim, I wondered. I could see her just ahead of me now, and I was closing fast, readying my silver chain. As I was about to cast it, she swerved to the left so that the tree lay between me and my target. Suddenly, a burly figure rose up to confront her. Arkwright! They seemed to collide. He fell. He fell. She staggered and ran on. We were in the open now, beyond the trees, making straight for the mound. Just as I was about to cast my chain, the light blazed out again. Again I was blinded, but this time I kept going. The witch's silhouette came into view against the round yellow doorway. Then all at once, darkness and silence. For a moment I didn't realize what had happened. The air was warmer and absolutely still. Lights flared on the rocky walls. I saw black candles in brackets and furniture. My eyes hadn't deceived me. There was a small table and 2 wooden straight-back chairs. I was inside the burial mound. I'd followed the witch through the magical door, and there she was, standing directly ahead of me, still gripping the rolled-up burial shroud, an expression of anger and bemusement on her face. I took a few deep breaths to calm myself and slow my pounding heart. "What a fool you be to follow me," cried the witch. "Do you always talk in rhyme?" I asked. The witch didn't reply because I spoke. I cast my silver chain, and it brought her to her knees, the links tight against her mouth to silence her. It was a perfect shot. I'd bound the witch, but now I had a real problem. There was no visible door. How was I going to get out of the mound? I searched the inside of the chamber carefully, running my fingers over the place where I'd thought I'd entered, but it was seamless. I was in a rocky cave without an entrance. Arkwright was on the outside. I was trapped inside. Had I bound the witch, or had she bound me? I looked at her. She was still gripping the shroud. Despite the chain, she hadn't dropped it. I knelt close to her, staring into her eyes, which seemed to crinkle with amusement. Beneath the chain, her mouth was pulled away from her teeth, half smile, half grimace. But her face wasn't that of the hideous hag I glimpsed as she washed the shroud. It could have belonged to a young countrywoman, passed with a second glance at a market. Perhaps she'd used some spell to try and scare me off. A mild form of dread, perhaps. I eased the chain from her mouth so that she could speak. It was a dangerous thing to do, but I urgently needed to question her, make her tell me how I could get out. But I soon realized that it was a big mistake. Her lips free of the chain, the witch was free to speak dark magic spells. And she began to do that immediately. She uttered 3 quick phrases, each in a language I'd never heard before, each ending in a rhyme. Then she opened her mouth very wide, and a thick black cloud of smoke erupted from it. I sprang to my feet and staggered backward. The cloud continued to grow to the point where her whole face was engulfed. It reminded me of the blood from the shroud that had stained the water of the lake. Now the air between us grew dark and tainted. The cloud was becoming even denser, and taking on a shape. There were wings, outstretched claws, a ravenous beak or a ravenous beak, I don't know. It had become a black crow. The witch's open mouth was a portal to the dark. It was the Morrigan, but this was no longer the bird of a normal size and proportions. It was nothing like the seemingly ordinary crow that had swooped through the trees to attack Bill Arkwright. This creature was immense. It was distorted and twisted into something grotesque. The beak, legs, and claws were elongated, stretching out toward me, while the head and body remained relatively small. But then the wings grew, too, until they reached out on either side of the monstrous bird to fill the available space. They flapped violently, battering against the walls of the chamber, and smashing the table that it broke in half. Its claws struck out at me. I ducked, and they raked the wall over my head, gouging deep grooves into the rock. For a moment I was filled with panic. A spook has little chance of defending one against defending. A spook has little chance of defeating one of the old gods. I was going to die here. I wasn't sure, but then I took a deep breath and calmed myself. My master had taught me well, and I knew that the first and most important thing to do was control my fear. I had faced great dangers from the dark before and survived. I could do so again. So I concentrated hard, feeling the strength rise within me, and confidence began to replace fear. There was anger, too. I acted without conscious decision, with a speed that astonished even me. I stepped forward, closer to the Morrigan, released the retractable blade, and swept my staff across from left to right. The blade cut deep into the bird's breast, slicing a bloody red line through the black feathers. There was a tremendous scream. The Morrigan convulsed and contracted, shrinking rapidly until she was no larger than life. Then she vanished, leaving behind only a few black feathers smeared with blood that fluttered slowly to the ground. The witch shook her head, her expression one of acute astonishment. "That's not possible," she cried. Who are you to be able to do such a thing? My name is Tom Ward, I told her. I'm a spook's apprentice, and my job is to fight the dark. She smiled grimly. Well, you fought your last fight, boy. There is no way you can escape this place. Soon the goddess will return. You will not find it so easy a second time. I smiled and looked down at the blood-splattered feathers littering the floor. Then I looked up and stared at her straight in the eye, doing my best not to blink. We'll see. Next time I might cut off her head. I was bluffing, of course, trying to appear more confident than I felt. I had to persuade this witch to open the door of the mound. You're a fool, boy. She'll return, slay you, and carry off your soul into her kingdom in the dark. In that case, you may suffer the same fate, I warned. You brought her into a dangerous situation that caused her pain. She might feel that should earn its own reward. I watched expressions flicker across the witch's face. Anger, uncertainty, and then fear. The old gods could be vindictive and vengeful, even toward their own servants. There was some truth in what I'd just said, and the witch knew it. So why don't you open the door so that we can leave this mound? I continued. What? So that you can kill me or bind me forever? Which fate do you have in store for me? Neither. Once outside, I'll release you from the chains. But in return, you must promise to stop cursing Mistress Wicklow and go back to Ireland. Why worry about her? She and her man were landowners who cared nothing at all for their servants and tenants. 6 years ago, when the crops failed, they let the people starve. They could have helped, but they didn't. I know nothing about that, but you've killed her husband. Isn't that enough, I asked? The witch frowned, but then she allowed the shroud to fall off from her left hand onto the floor. Help me to my feet, she commanded. I did as she asked, and she hobbled toward the rock wall and muttered words in the same strange language as before. There was a flare of pale light, and the doorway opened before us, gripping the chain. I pulled her forward into the cold night air. The moon bathed the mound behind us in a silver light. Release me, she commanded. Will you keep your word? Yes, but will you keep yours? I nodded with a flick of my wrist, released the witch from the chain. She smiled. Don't ever visit my land, boy. The Morrigan is much more powerful there, and she is vengeful. She would torment you beyond anything you can imagine. Whatever you do, stay away from Ireland. With that, the Banshee witch turned her back on me and made a sign in the air, muttering under her breath. Beyond her, the door faded and became the sheer grassy wall of the burial mound. I think she was about to turn back and say something to me, but she never got the chance. Something flew through the air toward her and buried itself between her shoulder blades. She fell down in the mud, a knife buried to the hilt in her back. She groaned, twitched twice, and lay still. Bill Arkwright walked toward me from the edge of the trees, carrying his staff and bag. You did a deal with her, Master Ward. Can't blame you. I suppose how else could you have gotten out of that mound? She would have kept her promise, I protested. She was going home. She wasn't going to complete the curse. You've just the word of a witch for that, Arkwright said. What I've just done makes things more certain. Now she can't complete the curse. Am I right? But I gave her my word. Blood and bone, cursed Arkwright. Grow up, boy. This is what we do. We kill witches. We fight the dark. If you can't stomach the job, go back to your farm. I didn't speak. I just stared down at the dead witch. What's done is done. What's done is done, said Arkwright, pulling the knife out of her back. If you're squeamish, don't linger here. So I walked back through the trees and waited for him on the bridge. Dead witches could scratch their way to the surface of their graves and go hunting for victims. He was cutting her heart out to make sure that she wouldn't come back. We went to see Mistress Wicklow, and Arkwright told her most of what happened. She seemed even more breathless than the previous night, but felt confident that she'd now make a full recovery. My master told her where the dead witch was, and she made arrangements to have her buried close to the mound. Then she paid him, and we took our leave of her. We walked back to the mill in silence. I was far from happy with what had happened, and couldn't bring myself to chat to Arkwright. He too seemed lost in his own thoughts. At last we waded through the salt moat that protects his garden from water witches and other creatures of the dark, and headed for the side door. Before we reached it, Claw started to bark. Well, at least somebody is speaking to me, Arkwright said. But when we went in, Claw didn't bound toward him as I'd expected. She was otherwise occupied. Good girl, Arkwright said, kneeling down to pat her on the head. She was feeding her newborn pups. There were 2 of them. Only 2? Only 2? What the frick? Usually they would have like 6 or 8 pups, because dogs have 12 nipples. So usually the most a human would have is 2 with twins, but the most a dog would have, I guess, is 12, because got 12 nipples. Anyway, enough with nipple talk. She was feeding her newborn pups. There were 2 of them. So what shall we call these 2 little beauties, Master Ward? I smiled. Blood and bone, I suggested. Arkwright grinned up at me. Perfect, he exclaimed. Couldn't have chosen better myself. That's what I'll call them. The pups had stopped feeding now. Arkwright got to his feet and reached down into his bag. Better safe than sorry, he said. A nice treat for a new mother. Then he pulled out the witch's heart and threw it to Claw. What the frick? Oh my god. So, whatever. That's just gross. I had other adventures with Bill Arkwright, but that's the one I'll never forget. It's because of what Mistress Wicklow said that those cut or scratches by the Morrigan are marked for death. They always die within a year. And Bill Arkwright did die less than a year later, sacrificing his life in Greece so that the spook Alice and I could escape. Perhaps we paid a high price for dealing with that Banshee witch. And that's it. So, that was my favorite story by far out of the whole thing. It gave very good portrayals of the characters, very good character development, and crafting the characters, and that I love that. I liked the ending where they named the puppies Blood and Bone because that was hilarious. I only think he said blood and bone like twice in the whole freaking story, but if I'm mistaken, just tell me. But anyway, and I also liked the kind of sad ending about Bill Arkwright dying, but I wanted to know that story with Grease so that the spook Alice and I could escape. If he did write that story, it would kind of spoil it, though. I don't know, but I want to know that story. But yeah, that was a great story. I really enjoyed that one. So I looked up the series, The Last Apprentice, Spooks, Wardstone Chronicles, whatever the frick you want to call it. Anyway, so in order, it's The Last Apprentice, The Revenge of the Witch, The Last Apprentice, The Curse of Bane, or just Curse of Bane, The Last Apprentice, Night of the Soul Starter, The Last Apprentice, Attack of the Fiend, The Last Apprentice, The Spook's Tale, and Other Horror. This one's marked by 4.5, so I guess it's a bunch of short stories. Then the fifth one is The Spook's Mistake. Then the sixth one, The Last Apprentice, Clash of the Demons. Okay. Then the 6.5 one is labeled 6.5. The Last Apprentice, A Coven of Witches, which is the one I have just read. So this is the 6.5 one in the series. Then the seventh one is The Last Apprentice, Rise of the Huntress. There are 2 chapters of this in the end of this book. I don't know if I'm going to read that or not. It's just 2 chapters. I might not. I don't know. The 7.5 one is The Ghost Prison. The 8th one, The Apprentice, The Last Apprentice, Rage of the Fallen. Then it's Spooks, I Am Grimalkin. Grimalkin the Witch Assassin. Okay. 10. The Last Apprentice, Lure of the Dead. 11. The Last Apprentice, Slithered. Or just Slither. The Last Apprentice, I Am Alice. So that's Alice. The Last Apprentice, The Spook's Revenge. And then The Spook's Bestiary, A Guide to Creatures of the Dark. And then El Aprendiz del Espectro. It's the title is Spanish. It's just labeled Seventh Son, and apparently it's a feature film. Or I mean, a major motion picture. But The Spook's Revenge looks like this website isn't updated. Hasn't been updated in a while. I might do my own list because The Spook's Revenge, from the first one down to The Spook's Bestiary and The Seventh Son. If I go up to the Wikipedia, it actually separates them into the main series from Revenge of the Witch to I Am Alice, and then there's the 13th one, Fury of the Seventh Son, which is probably this one. Maybe, I don't know. But then it has another series, the Starblade Chronicles, and then another series, Aberrations, and then another series which he hasn't finished yet. Look at that, he's still writing books. Spook's Brother Wolf. Then there's related books. This one's printed in the UK and the US. Still, the Spook's Tale, Interception Point, the Spook Stories, Witches, the Spook's Bestiary, the Ghost Prison. So the Spook Story Witches, a collection of short stories, which is the one I just read. Look at that. Spook's Tale, Interception Point. Okay. The Spook Stories, Witches, the Bestiary, okay. The Ghost Prison, the book occupies the same world as the Wardstone Chronicles, but with different characters and storylines. Cool. The Spook's Seventh Apprentice, a novella featuring the Spook's Seventh Apprentice, a boy named Will Johnson. And then The Last Apprentice, a collection of short stories that, the Spook's Tale, which is this one. And then it has Alice's Tale, Grimalkin's Tale, a gallery of villains. That was 2009. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that was 2009 too. Oh, they're both 2009. Cool. Last Apprentice, the Spook's Bestiary, the Guide to Creatures of the Dark. So all three of these take the place of 2009. Cool. So it's the Spook's Tale, Alice's Tale, Grimalkin's Tale, and a gallery of villains. So that's the one that I guess takes place before. What would that be? 2009. What's 2000? Both of them would be after the Spook sacrifice, and then it would carry on like normal, I'm guessing. Well, then there's the Ghost Prison, which I can make my own list, but yeah, that's a lot of freaking books. If I do, the next one I would get, because I don't know where I got this one. I don't know where I got this book from, but if I would get another one, it would probably just be the first one. If I were to get another book from this series, it would probably just be the first one because it's the first one. This is technically like 6.5, but yeah. So, cool. So yeah, that's The Last Apprentice, a Coven of Witches. Specifically the Banshee Witch, but we are done with it, with the book. Some great stories in here. Out of the four, I think my favorite would be the last one. My second favorite would be the first one. My third favorite would be the third one. The one with the Brain Guzzler. And then my least favorite would be Dirty Dora, but I still loved it. I still loved that one. Great book. Never read it before. It was on my bookshelf forever. I was like, why do I have this? I better read it. So, there you go. Spent, the first video was an hour and a half. The second video was an hour. The third video was an hour and a half again. So that would be an hour and a half plus another hour. That would be 2.5 hours. Plus another hour and a half. Let's see, 2 hours and a half, that'd be 3 hours, and another hour, that's 4 hours, and this one's 2 hours. So that would be, I spent over like 5 hours reading this book. Man, that's a pretty good book, man. I like that. I like that. If you would like me to read any other book, or a collection of short stories or whatever, if you would like me to continue, reading, if you even got to this point in the video, if you would like me to continue the Jacob Reed series, tell me. Let me know. Like the video or whatever. Let me know if you enjoyed this or not. But yeah, that's it for Last Apprentice's Coven of Witches. Very interesting universe he's made. I'll definitely at some point read the first book. I'll get the first book and read that and check that out. But dang, this book series is 1 year. I'm 1 year older than this book series. Wow. But whatever. If you want to see more of these readings of other stuff, then yeah, tell me. And yep, that's it. Bye.